University to be here this morning to share that story, a story we hope to learn from and understand better how we can apply some of the practices in our own work. We then invited Sandy Shugart to be, at first we thought, oh, well, we'll have the counterpart, we'll have the Valencia story. And Sandy said, I want to be David Frost. I want to interview Timothy. I want to get everything I can out of him and learn as much as I can about the Georgia State experience. So we said, great, let's do it. So this morning, would you help me please welcome to the stage Timothy Rennick, who's Vice Provost at Georgia State, and Sandy Shugart, President of Valencia College.
Little known fact, at this hotel, we actually had to use our magic bracelets this morning to get the mic to work. I am very honored to be here for two reasons. First, because I am very supportive of the mission and the work that this organization does. As Carol was just mentioning, I think there's a lot of overlap between the challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis and the challenges we face at Georgia State University. And I'm going to outline some of those to you in just a few minutes. The other reason I'm happy to be here is because I'm actually here. 2 times over the last 3 weeks, I have had scheduled conferences that I've not been able to attend because of the new winter capital of the United States, Atlanta, Georgia. Some of you, I think, saw the snow jam images. I was supposed to be in San Diego that day and literally couldn't get to the airport because every road in Atlanta was clogged. The best line I heard about it was Bill Maher's. He said, tens of thousands of Atlantans trapped in their cars, some of them for over 20 hours, and all of them had the same question on their mind. What the hell did we do to piss off Chris Christie? What I'm going to tell you today is the story, I think, that may resonate with you and some of the issues going on your campuses, the story of what we've done at Georgia State over the last 10 years to try to move the numbers and try to bring a better outlook and future to our students. I'm going to start with some national data, and it's sobering. This is a chart from the New York Times. It may be difficult to read from the back of the room, but let me just give you a sense of what it's trying to capture. It shows the percent of Americans who hold the bachelor's degree, and it tracks over the last 40 years. The horizontal axis goes back to 1970 to the present. The vertical axis is the percent of students or individuals, excuse me, who hold a bachelor's, and it's disaggregated by economic quartile. Even if you can't read the numbers, I don't need to tell you which quartile represents which economic group in America. For the top 25% of Americans over the last 40 years, there have been significant gains made in college completion. That number in 1970 was around 40%. It now is well over 80%, so a doubling. There has been some significant movement in the next quartile of Americans by annual household income, from about 15% to well over 30%. But it's those bottom 2 bands that should concern not only all of us in this room, but all of America, because despite all the efforts nationally to bring success to low-income students, despite all the promises of us being a nation of equal opportunity, the reality has been very different than that. If you look at that bottom 25% of Americans, in 40 years, despite all of our efforts, Pell programs and initiatives and so forth, we moved the dial from 6% to 8%. It's also a good introduction to Georgia State University and to many of your campuses, I know, as well, because day to day, the majority of students we're dealing with at Georgia State are represented in that bottom 25% of Americans. These are our Pell numbers since the onset of the recession at Georgia State. We've moved from about 30% to almost 60% of our students on Pell. As I think most of you know, the average Pell family in America has an annual household income of $20,000. And this is the norm for our students. In fact, if you take the lower 25%, these Pell students, plus the next band who also haven't moved over the last 40 years. That's about 85% of the students we deal with day to day. As Carol mentioned, Georgia State is one of the most diverse four-year research institutions in the nation. We've, over the last decade, moved from 60% of our students being white to 61% of our students being non-white. You can see the economic profile in this chart. We also serve about 40% of our students are first-generation college students. And what we've tried to do, because we're not a well-resourced university, we're not a flagship, there are much better funded universities like Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia in the public university system in Georgia. We've tried to be very efficient with our resources and very strategic about our moves, and we've used data aggressively in order to make those decisions. One of the metrics we're tracking and have been for years for every single student is their level of unmet need. Unmet need is an objective metric. It's based upon the difference between the total cost of education. At Georgia State, it's a little over $20,000 a year. That includes not only tuition and fees, but room and board, books, other expenses. It's a federal objective number based upon a cost of living data point that the federal government can give you for your particular region and area. And what we do is then look at each individual student and pile up the resources that each student has for the academic year. In the state of Georgia, that includes the Hope Scholarship, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. It includes Pell, as you see, for the majority of our students. Over 95% of our undergraduates have some type of loan out, a family contribution. We also assume that they're working 20 hours a week and dedicating the income from that work to their cost of education. In an ideal world, the resources we pile up would equal the total cost of an education. You all know we don't live in an ideal world. With the exception of a few elites, few institutions nationally are able to support students so that they have their need met. And at Georgia State, the vast majority of students, about 60%, 65% of our students any given semester have significant levels of unmet need. Those levels are getting worse overall. These are the average levels of unmet need at Georgia State over the last 7 or 8 years. There was a brief dip in the first couple years of the Obama administration because the Obama administration increased the maximum payout for Pell and at the same time also broadened eligibility requirements so more students and more families qualified. But at the peak of the recession, the governor of Georgia made serious cuts to the Hope Scholarship program, and you can see any gains that we made in the middle of the chart were quickly lost, and we've been setting record numbers, unfortunately, year after year. In fact, this past year, the average unmet need for a Georgia State student was over $6,000. The average unmet need for a senior, often they're running out of eligibility for different aid programs by their senior year, was over $8,000. When I talk to some legislators about this sort of data, they say, well, when I went to school, you know, I worked jobs and so forth, but do recognize that these unmet need levels assume the students are working 20 hours a week. So if you are going to say that the student can work additionally to fill the gap, then you're asking them to be full-time students and work full-time at the same time. It's also a very unrealistic statement given the type of students we're serving. When you're an underrepresented, first-generation, low-income college student looking for a job in town Atlanta in the peak of the recession, you're very unlikely to find one that's going to fit your class schedule and nicely fill the gap of $8,000 a year. The sad thing about unmet need is it does correlate to academic performance. This is Georgia State data as well. This chart just captures two very simple metrics. On the horizontal line is our levels of unmet need. On the far left, you have the students who have all their need met, have sufficient resources to pay to be full-time students. On the far right, students who have as much as $15,000 a year unaccounted for. So levels of unmet need at very high rates. The vertical axis just shows the percent of Georgia State students who are able to hold on to a 3.0 GPA. And what you see, and I've challenged faculty audiences to find another single indicator that's a better predictor of academic performance. As levels of unmet need go up, then the grade point average goes down, the number of students who maintain a 3.0 goes down. Goes from over 60% of the students with all the need met to about 27% of the students who have high levels of negative need. In the state of Georgia, that's crucial for not just the students at Georgia State, but for all the students at our two-year institutions, because many of the students come into college on Hope scholarships. These are granted to students who maintain a 3.0 high school GPA as long as they maintain a 3.0 college GPA. Well, here as of 2008, and I use 2008 because I'm going to talk about some steps we've taken to try to mitigate this outcome, were the graduation rates of students who came in on Hope and held on to the scholarship, 61%, and those who came in on Hope, and they were in many ways equally qualified for college because it meant that they had a 3.0 high school GPA, came in on Hope and lost it. 40-point drop in graduation rates. And that's one of the crucial things to track with regard to any of your students who are on aid programs, is how you can keep them on those programs, because as soon as they lose the scholarships, in many cases, they're dropping out. When your annual household income is $20,000 a year and you lose a scholarship that's worth $7,000 a year, then it's pretty clear what's going to happen. That merit-based scholarship is really an access scholarship. It's really the opportunity for students to stay enrolled, and our students were dropping out. The sad part of this story is when we looked at the details, many of these students were not poor students. They were not bombing out academically at all. In fact, many of them had 2.8, 2.9 GPAs, were doing everything they needed to do. But because they were having this scholarship taken away by their GPA dropping below a 3.0, they were losing out on the college experience. So what have we done? Well, we've used data aggressively to try to, as I say, really use the limited resources we have to best effect. We've piloted programs at small scale. We've been very willing to admit defeat and point out when programs aren't working and revise them. And we have then gone out to promote those programs that are successful, and I think most crucially, scale them to a large size. In fact, we don't even engage in pilot programs unless there's a reasonable model for us to be able to scale the program up. I've been on many, many panels nationally where you hear of this great initiative that's going on at college X or Y, and you ask them, well, how many students are involved in this? And it's 20 students, it's 40 students, it's 60 students. That's nice, but that's not going to move the needle. That's not going to be transformative. And the programs that I'm going to describe that we've engaged in start at the hundreds and in some cases go to impacting tens of thousands of students. I'll give you some examples, some specific examples that we've employed. We were playing a game at Georgia State which is played nationally by four-year institutions and some 2 years. It's a cynical game. In order to boost quality numbers, we were taking the weakest part of the fall freshman class and deferring them to the spring semester, because then they don't count against your so-called quality numbers, and they don't count as the part of the cohort you're tracking. The problem with that model is very obvious. You're taking the weakest academically prepared students from the fall class, starting them in the spring semester where everybody else has had a 6-month head start. And when we looked at the data, not surprisingly, these students were doing very, very poorly. They were doing abysmally. And it wasn't a moral way to handle the situation. So I went to the president and asked for permission to take a hit in SAT scores. We actually dropped our SAT scores 19 points in 2 years, because what we started to do is send these same students a letter welcoming them to Georgia State for the fall class on one condition. Not that they defer their admission to the spring, but that they come for a 7-week summer semester. There's some issues with Pell now and Pell eligibility that makes this very attractive. It means that students can actually get Pell for 3 consecutive semesters. We can talk about that a little later on if you're interested. But the real point here is getting these students off to a good head start. So now we take the lowest 5% of the fall class by our predictive analytics academically. We don't use race or ethnicity. We're looking purely at academic qualifications and have them come during the summer semester. You can see some of the results here. They're taking 4 college courses that count towards their bachelor's degree. They're getting all of our aid programs, advisement, support, supplemental instruction, financial literacy, because we find one of the most dangerous things for low-income students is they make bad economic decisions early on. They take 60% of their aid package for the year and spend it during the first couple weeks of the fall semester, and this quickly puts them on a path that's going to lead to them dropping out. So we do all these things, and you can see some of the results. Last summer, this group, who supposedly was our lowest 5% of the incoming class, finished the summer with a 3.3 GPA. They actually finished the academic year with a slightly higher GPA than the 95% of the class that is supposed to be better prepared. We have used freshman learning communities aggressively, but it's a low-cost program. Our model is just to arrange the students in the right configuration. We're a large university, 32,000 students at a downtown urban campus. It can be intimidating for new students as they come in. What we do is take students and match them in sets of 25 and have them take all 5 of their fall classes together and then several of their spring classes together. We don't have to invest a lot of resources. It's a matter of us just registering the students in a certain sequence, but you know the results. It builds study partners, it builds friendships. If somebody misses a class, they have somebody they can get the notes from, they can study for midterms and finals with and so forth. And again, here you can see some of the results from this relatively low-cost program. The students have a better and a stronger GPA, they are retained at a better rate, and then most encouragingly, as we track these students out over 6 years, they're graduating at an equally high rate, or also getting the same bump in their graduation rates. Here's a program we've tried that would be applicable to any of your students who are on particular scholarships. We call it Keep Hope Alive because of the Hope Scholarship in Georgia and because some of those dismal statistics for the students who lose the Hope Scholarship. When we looked at how many dollars are lost by Georgia State students every year because of the loss of the Hope Scholarship, it's over $20 million. We had nowhere near the resources to fill that gap and to allow those students to continue by our own funding. So we were given $40,000 by our foundation and told to try to come up with some innovative program. What we came up with was a model where the semester after students lose the Hope Scholarship, they're given $500 for 2 consecutive semesters, as long as they sign a contract. And for all the students who are participating in our programs, we do 2 things. We have them sign a physical contract. We actually have them come into an office and do it, not online, because we want them to meet somebody and talk about their obligations in return for the money. We also use card swipes. They cost under $100 each. They connect to laptops or desktops, and the students use their college IDs when they participate in programs like this or any of the other ones I described and swipe their cards. So we have complete demographic information about who's participating, who's not, and we can use that data then to track the students and track the success of the programs. And what we do in this case is for the $500 for those 2 semesters, they sign a contract agreeing to meet with their advisors, go to financial literacy workshops, go to academic skills workshops. Again, here you can see some of the results up on the board. Overall, it's very difficult for students who drop below a 3.0 and lose the scholarship to reverse trends. Only 9% of Georgia State students who lose the Hope Scholarship gain it back again. The first year we did this program, over 40% gained it back again. The last 2 years, over 60% of the students gained it back again. That's leveraging for $1,000 a student. On average, they're gaining back about $12,000 worth of scholarship dollars for our investment of about $1,000 each student. We have also tried to leverage another of our competitive advantages, which we have lots of work-study students at Georgia State. And we had previously been assigning them the typical tasks across campus. They worked in the library, they worked in the cafeteria, they were given office duty of answering phones or sitting at desks and so forth. What we started to do is a program where we looked at the DFW rates, the failure rates, for our freshman and sophomore year courses and found which were the real bottlenecks, the courses that were holding up students from success. We then looked at our roster of work study and other supported work students at Georgia State and found undergraduates who had done well in these same courses. Now we pull those students out of their current assignments, we pay them to be trained as tutors, we pay them to sit in on the same academic course they were successful in previously so that they get to know the new instructor and the new cohort of students, and we pay them to do instructional sessions, tutoring sessions, during the course of every week of the semester. Because we're tracking the students by their swipe cards, we know that the students who show up for this program are very different than the programs who show up for professor office hours. The students who show up for professors' office hours tend to be more white and more upper class economically. Here's a program where you're connecting students with somebody who's much more like themselves. And again, you can see from this chart some of the results. This is just a sampling of some of the courses. We do it for about 25 undergraduate courses now. But the students perform about half a letter grade better and are being retained at rates that are about 8 or 9 points higher. Here's a problem for all of our campuses, math and the math requirement. In the state of Georgia, all college students, even to get the associate's degree, need to complete a college math level course. Our students were not doing so at high rates. 5 years ago, the DFW rates for college algebra were in pre-calculus were 43%. We piloted another model. We tried an emporium model. We used various sorts of structures and situations, including having the students come to a lecture, but then do some of the work online on their own. We found that that did not work. What did work was the current model, 1 hour of traditional lecture each week, 3 hours in a lab in which they're in the lab with their fellow classmates, so it's still during the class meeting time, and they're in there with their instructor, but they're all working at computers on adaptive learning exercises so that students are not falling behind in the first and second week and then getting totally lost by the third week in the semester, and strong students in math are not getting bored by the fact that the same questions are being asked or the same problems are coming up again and again. And what we found is that this model has worked much, much better for our students. As with many of our programs, when we find something that works particularly well, we take away the students' options. So last academic year, we didn't offer a single section of college algebra in a traditional lecture format. Every single section we offered was in this format. You can see the numbers. We've lowered the DFW rate from 43% to 21% in 5 years. It's not where we want to be yet, and we have other initiatives going on here. But we were able to scale it at a very large scale. So every single seat we offered last year, over 7,500 seats, were offered in this format. That's the difference between 1,600 plus more students passing math their first time through. And because this was a required course, what we found was happening under the old model is students were getting D's and F's or withdrawing and then coming right back the next semester with no better prospect for succeeding the second time through, taking the course again. They were sometimes losing their Hope Scholarship or dropping out just because of this one course. And in other cases, even if they finally got through the course, they were using up so much funded credit in order to pass their math requirement, they were running out before they graduated. So this change has really made a huge, huge difference for us at Georgia State. Here's a very simple idea. It's going to sound expensive at first blush, but give me a second to explain this because it's really not expensive at all. This is a simple concept. It actually got enough attention that there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that featured us initiating the program, which is in some ways sad because you're going to hear how simple it is and how more campuses should be trying it. One of the biggest challenges and one of the most sobering moments of every semester for me as the Chief Enrollment Officer at Georgia State and the person in charge of our success programs is the fee drop period. The state law in Georgia requires that at the end of the first week of classes, we drop any student who has not paid 100% of their tuition and fees. That is a harsher rule, I know, than may apply in your state, but our Attorney General has said that this is an illegal gratuity if we allow students to continue and enroll that haven't paid all their tuition and fees by the end of the first week of the semester. So historically, we have been dropping hundreds and in some semesters thousands of students at the end of the first week. And these are exactly the students you do not want to be dropping. For one thing, they're the academically prepared students, meaning that they've met all the prerequisites, they've done what they need to do, they're registered for their classes. Number two, and we all know how difficult this is, they want to be there. They want to be in the class studying, and we're wiping out their schedule, and in many cases, this stopout is turning into a dropout. Well, the program we started was very simple. What we do now is, at the moment of the drop, I have a cadre of our staff in enrollment services at the phones, and we're using two metrics. One we're using is the unmet need metric I described earlier. So we know to start any student who has genuine unmet need. Secondly, we're looking at some of the academic analytics that I'm going to talk about in just a second. So for any student who has genuine unmet need and who is on path for graduation, doing what they need to do to put themselves on the right path academically, then we just start with the student who owes the least amount of money, call them up and say, you know, I know you were just dropped from your classes, don't make any plans for Monday morning because we've just covered your bill. Come back, you're in classes for the fall. The first couple semesters we did this, we literally had dozens of students hanging up on us because they thought it was a scam. They couldn't believe that anybody from Georgia State would be trying to help them. And I will say one of the advantages of a program like this, if you can scale it up, is that it does begin to change students' attitudes. It's amazing when you begin to look at, what they're thinking. They think we're against them. They think that we're setting up obstacles and trying to prevent them from graduating. So it's been important in that respect. But what is amazing about the program is how economical it is. Because think about this. We're only using it for students who owe us tuition and fees. It's not covering other charges, just tuition and fees. So we give a student this grant. Last year, the average grant was $900, and we're immediately getting back, instantaneously getting back $900 because it's all coming initially or immediately back to the university. But more than that, all these students have paid some portion of their bill already. So in no case is their entire bill $900. In many cases, they paid $3,000 and they still owe $900. So we're not only getting back the $900 immediately, we're gaining back the $3,000 that would be wiped away. And some of it might be Pell money or loan money or family contribution or other things, but that's all coming back to the university as well. And third, they're not stopping out. So what we found is that the average student who gets one of these grants enrolls 3 more semesters after they get the grant, and as a result, we're getting those revenues as well. So if you have any resistance to a model like this from your CFO on campus, then talk it through and think, what does it actually mean from a revenue perspective? We know what it means from a human perspective, which is an amazing opportunity for these students. What we found last year, and you can see how large this program became very quickly. In a couple years, last year we brought 2,600 students back to classes via this program. Over half of these students were seniors because they're the group that's running out of HOPE dollars, of Pell dollars, of other aid before they've reached the finish line. I should mention, especially to this group, that over 60% of Georgia State undergraduates are transfer students. We're the largest transfer recipient university in the state of Georgia. And so many of these students have had other courses at other institutions. By the time they get to Georgia State, they've decided to change majors, and they're running out of funded credit hours before they graduate. So over 50% of the students we gave the grants to were seniors, and 70% of the seniors we gave these grants to last year graduated within 2 semesters. Yeah, it's amazing. It's not possible to really say how many of those that 70% would have graduated without the grants, but clearly we're talking about a program that in and of itself maybe brought another 1,000 completions to Georgia State last year alone. The final program I'm going to talk about, and it's the most elaborate, but we hope the most impactful ultimately, is our advising tracking system. We've gotten a lot of attention for using predictive analytics in order to track each individual undergraduate student. This is a partnership with the Education Advisory Board in Washington, D.C. They're now working with about 90 universities nationally, and about 10 of them are community colleges. What they did is that we've looked at 10 years of our RPG data, over 2.5 million Georgia State grades. We have nightly feeds from our banner system, so the data is constantly being updated. And what we now have are predictive analytics, which I'll show you in a second, for how each student will do in every major that we offer and in many, many of our undergraduate courses. The system is based upon 700 different alerts. The way to understand these alerts is there are lots of bad decisions students can make academically, but not all bad decisions are equally harmful to their chances of graduating. So what we've tried to do by mining 10 years worth of data is find the decisions that students make or the actions that students take that are particularly harmful to their prospects for graduating. Let me give you an example of some of these alerts, and these are very simple ones. Some are more nuanced and complicated. This is actual Georgia State data, and what it shows is the predictive value of the grade that a student gets in the first course of what eventually becomes his or her major. So the middle of the chart shows, for instance, political science. And it's really, for most of you, many of you have been in the classroom before, makes a lot of sense when you pause to think about it. For political science majors who get an A or B in the first political science course they take, they graduate at what for Georgia State are very good rates, so 75, 80%. They get a C in the same course, their graduation rate goes down to 25%. Why? Well, clearly, if you're a C student in the first course in, say, American government, there's some skills or some problem there that you're lacking that's going to be highlighted by the time you're taking upper level courses, writing longer papers, doing research work, and so forth. But the reality is, what had Georgia State and what do most institutions do when a political science major gets a C grade in the first political science course they take? Yeah, absolutely nothing. We were just letting that student pass by. We may have been reaching out to the F students, but we certainly were not paying attention to the C students. But the C students are the students who we have the chance of changing the trajectory for. Those are the ones who, if we intervene at the right moment, we might make a real difference. A great example of this is our accounting majors. We found, even though the accounting faculty says that the minimum grade a student needs in their first math course to be able to take upper level accounting courses is C, that the students who got C's in their first math course did terribly in upper level accounting courses once they began enrolling. Then they get the D's and F's, and then they're losing their Hope Scholarship, they're losing other aid, they're dropping out of the university. What we found from the data is that to be on track for graduation, the accounting major actually needed a B+ in the first course that they take in accounting. Now, when the student gets below a B in that course, or B or below in that course, there's an alert that goes off, and there's an intervention. We might be able to salvage more of our low-income first-generation students and allow them to succeed in some of the toughest majors across the university if we pay more attention to certain types of this data. Because if we can get this accounting major the help, an added math course, some tutoring, before they take those upper-level classes, they have a much better prospect for succeeding. This is an actual student, and I know that the type is going to be small here and hard for a lot of you to read, but it's actually a sad story. This is a pre-med student who came to Georgia State in 2008. I blocked out the name, but these alerts were going off. We didn't have the system live at the time, but when we turned the system on in the summer of 2012, we had over 170,000 alerts that went off historically from all our existing students. But what you see there is a tale of a lost cause that needn't have been lost. That the first semester he enrolled, he was supposed to be in a chem class, didn't even sign up for it. He was supposed to get a minimum grade in a math course, didn't get that minimum grade, and nobody raised a finger, nobody tried to help the student. And as you go through this kind of history, you see semester after semester he's digging himself into a deeper and a deeper hole, to the point where now when we turn the system on, he can no longer be a pre-med major. In a better scenario, a better world where we were doing our jobs at a better rate, we might have been able to help him succeed and reach his goals. Another nice aspect of this system is what is called the major matcher. Because we have predictive analytics for how students will do in every course, we can call up any individual major and see a chart like this very quickly. It shows for any major selected in the gray shaded area the courses that the student has already taken and the grades he or she has gotten in those courses. And then in the white area, the courses that remain, the required courses that remain, and the prospects, the analytics for how difficult that course will be for the student. So instead of the old model, which unfortunately repeated itself thousands of times, where a student comes into advising, is bombing in a major, and the advisor says, well, you're going to need to pick something else, you can actually have a coherent and structured discussion. When this system went live, we began tracking attendance at our central advising offices, and we've just hit an anniversary mark. First year we had the system live, we had almost 34,000 individual students visits to our advising center, almost tripling the number of advisor visits we had prior to the system going live. And when we asked the students what was going on, they told us that the advising sessions were much more meaningful because they felt that they were getting something factual and additional about their own condition, as opposed to the old model where they thought it was just kind of homespun advice that they were getting from their advisor. It allows us to track analytics, since we know every student, whether they're on track, off track, or the yellow is a middle ground. We can track by majors. We can track longitudinally. So now it's become a challenge for departments, not so much to equal other departments. On this chart you can see at Georgia State there are many more art majors who are on path for graduation than chemistry majors. Not shocking news to most of us. But can chemistry improve their numbers from one semester to the next? We're now tracking this sort of data for every individual advisor. So it's become a good competition on campus for advisors to say, I want to move more of my students from red to green. If it was just that superficial, then of course that wouldn't mean anything. But behind these color coding are 10 years worth of tracking data. And moving somebody from red to green really does mean you're improving their prospects for graduation. In the first year we had the system live, we found that more freshmen were changing their majors. Changing their major in and of itself is not a good thing if you track RPG data. Students who change their major in the junior and senior years have lower chances of graduating. But if you can get the student, especially first-generation low-income students, into the right major from the start, you're on a much better path to their success. And what we found is the system helped us get more students at the freshman year changing the major, and the vast majority of their students were these students were changing their majors to majors in which they were more likely to be successful. Another metric we've been used to try to track this is, over the course of an academic year, out of all our undergraduates, how many students have increased their chances of graduation? How many have improved their prospects rather than lowered their prospects? Well, in the baseline years, we didn't assume that the number would be 0 because we had all kinds of other efforts, and assuming they were effective, there would be some progress made. But once we went live with the system, what we found is a huge uptick. So the first 2 years represent baseline years. The third on the chart represents the first year under this new analytics program. And we found almost 3/4 of our students, as opposed to under 60%, had actually increased their chances for graduating over the course of the academic year. So a couple results here. We've gotten a lot of nice attention. That's always good. It's certainly pleasing to my bosses to be cited in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. But these are the real results that really count. These are Georgia State's conferrals over the last 5 years. We are now conferring 1,700 more degrees on an annual basis than we were just 5 years ago. That's not because of increased enrollments. And that's a very different. In fact, just the opposite. What we've done, as you heard earlier on, is enroll a student body that, by all objective measures, you would think would be much harder to graduate. More Pell students, more first generation, more non-white students. And it's a very different projection for their quality of life for years and years to come because of that different result. There are 6-year graduation rates. They're not where we want them to be yet, but I will say for 4-year research institutions, that's the largest increase over the last 10 years, a 21-point increase. Let me put them in some other contexts. One way to look at that number is to compare to other institutions. Each of these diamonds represent a national research university. You can see one side of the chart represents the percent of students on Pell and the other graduation rates. And nationally, as Pell rates go up, not surprisingly, graduation rates go down precipitously. But Georgia State's that little circled diamond in the upper right there corner. And at least among our peer institutions now, we have by far both the highest Pell rate and by far the highest graduation rate. These programs can make a difference. Another encouraging bit of news from this, and this is something that's been observed at Georgia State by the Education Trust, is these programs raise and have been proven to raise all groups, but with a little twist on it. The blue bar represents our graduation rates by each of these racial ethnic groups 10 years ago. The red bar are our current rates. And what you can see is all groups have improved, but the groups that were most distressed and most underserved at the start of the time period are those who benefit the most from these interventions. Many of our middle-class white kids have already had tutoring, have already had interventions, and people talk to them. But for some of the students who have been served by some of the poorest public schools in metro Atlanta and in rural Georgia, these kind of interventions can really be transformative. So look at the increase in our graduation rates for our African American and then our Hispanic students. Our Latino numbers have tripled over the last 10 years. The green bar represents something that I encourage all of you to begin to think about doing, which is we're tracking the cohort represented in the red bar using National Student Clearinghouse data across multiple institutions nationally. And what we find, and this is true of low-income first-generation students nationally, they're much more transient than our upper middle class and middle class students. Their families lose and gain jobs. They move from one part of the country to the next. They're going to move from institution to another. And what the green represents are the number of students in the red cohort who are successful when you track them across multiple institutions. And there, those numbers go up dramatically. At the University of Georgia, the flagship in my state, the difference between the red bar and the green bar for UGA is about 3 points. At Georgia State, that difference is about 25 points, and I'm sure that difference will be even more dramatic at many of your institutions. And those numbers we're looking at with the green bar, the success rates across the board, are much more comparable to the graduation rates of Georgia Tech and University of Georgia, both of which are around 80% in the state of Georgia. So in summary, just what's happened over the last couple months. We have set a new record for the number of degrees we've conferred at Georgia State. We now graduate the most Latino students in the state of Georgia. We were named one of the top 100 Hispanic serving universities in the nation. We graduate the most Asian American students in Georgia, and we're now number 49 in the nation for graduating Asian American students. The Education Trust said that we had the second highest increase in graduation rates for underrepresented students in the nation. This is one of the Education Trust charts, it's actually capturing 2004 to 2010, so it's not as updated as far as the data that I was citing a minute ago. But over that 6-year period, we increased our graduation rate for Latino students by over 37%. And then for the last 2 years, a kind of historical moment in U.S. history, Georgia State has now conferred more bachelor's degrees on an annual basis to African American students than any other university in the country. It's the first time in U.S. history that a distinction has gone to a non-HBCU. If you look at that middle column, it's the percent of the graduates who are in that racial category. You can see it's a little over 30% of our graduates, and it's over 90% of the next 4 schools, admittedly, schools with smaller enrollments. But the point is, in various sorts of ways, for various sorts of groups, these programs can make not only a difference, they can make a transformative difference. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to talk to you further.
Well, I hope you're as impressed as I am. That was a great presentation, and we've got about 20 minutes to unpack in a little bit more detail what you've done at Georgia State. So thank you. And I want to pursue just 3 themes with you, 3 kind of working theories behind your work. The first has to do with the connection between finances and performance. The second, the role of analytics and the way you've approached analytics. And the third is the leadership, both the organizational leadership and the personal leadership required to make this kind of large-scale change in your organization. That be okay?
Yeah, perfect.
And if there's time at the end, I don't know if we got the mics in or not. Yes, we did. So we'll try to reserve just a few minutes at the end for audience questions as well.
Great.
Good. So this notion that there are alterable variables in the financial equation that can affect student performance is an interesting and relatively new idea to our sector, I think. Community colleges are so inexpensive that we tend not to think of finances as an alterable variable. It's just a variable in the universe that we have to deal with. So we can lay off blame for a lot of what happens to our students on the financial issues, but many of us have not gone very deep in figuring out what we can do about it. So I want you to talk, just to go a little bit deeper into this connection between finance and performance and try to summarize for us the collage of things that you've put together to address that question.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the lessons that we learned by necessity is the fact that there are ways to leverage with small interventions much greater resources for the students. And we had to do that because if you actually start with some of the math in those early charts I showed, so you take the fact that we have over 14,000 of our 25,000 undergraduates with unmet need, the average level of unmet need is over $6,000. You do the math, and you're talking about tens of millions of dollars that the students are short every academic year. There's no way for us to fill in those gaps. So what can we do in order to make small interventions have the greatest amount of payout? And that's a common theme for just about all the programs that we talked about. You know, freshman learning communities, we can't pay to have all the tutoring staff we would like in order to have the interventions and create the community with 32,000 students enrolled that we would like to. And we know that students drop out very quickly, especially at an urban campus like Georgia State, when they feel alienated and out of place. So we leverage the way we do registration. We're doing registration anyhow. It's not causing us to create any additional courses. Those 25 students travel together. If it's a 75 student enrolled class, they are 25 students among the 75. We're not changing the size of the class, but it is giving them the experience as if they are in a much more personal and smaller context. Supplemental instruction, same idea. We're already paying these students, or the federal government in many cases is paying the students. Isn't there a way to actually make the experience a much more personalized one so they're getting the kind of attention students might at an elite private institution? If there's one way to summarize a lot of what may be going on, not just at Georgia State, but other institutions that are using some of these technologies at a large scale, it is in one way trying to approximate the experience that we've known for generations to work with students. If you have smaller classes, that helps your graduation and completion rates. If you have personalized attention, that helps your graduation rates. Nobody in this room, and not us at Georgia State, can afford to offer average class sizes of 10 to 12 students. What we can do with technology is approximate that, and I think the lesson of Georgia State is that that can make a real difference.
It occurs to me as one who has to deal with a college foundation, as many of you do, that there's an opportunity for our foundations to become part of the solution. Ours is asking the question, if you're awarding $150 or $160 million a year in federal financial aid, what difference does our $1 million or $2 million or $3 million a year in scholarships make? It's a fair question. And there may be an opportunity there to reorient their philanthropy towards leveraging the aid that's already being added to the mix for those students.
I agree with that completely. I mean, recognize that not only most of your foundation boards, but most of your legislators have some background in the business world. Very few of them are professional educators. Many of them are people who have gained prominence in the business world. Well, they have a great deal of skepticism about higher education these days. And one of the biggest impacts of a presentation like this, when I go to the Coca-Cola Foundation or the foundation board at Georgia State, is the fact that it confounds their expectations. That we are doing things that they would like to think are done in the business world, they certainly don't think are done in academia. And one of the ways that we've been able to leverage this to increase our impact, not just with foundation boards, but with our state legislators, is to actually be able, via the data we've collected, to make certain kind of assurances about what would happen with the money. It's not just give us, $5 million and we'll try to make things work better. It's if you give us $5 million for these 3 specific programs, we can increase the conferrals by 1,100 here and by 300 there and by another 200 there. And for the most part, we've been able to deliver or exceed the promises that we've made.
And to be able to do that, you started with a kind of analysis that's not common to us. The enrollment management world is much more mature in the independent colleges because of tuition discounting and their economic model. It's more mature in the university world. It's a little less mature in the community college world, again, because finances was just treated as something that's regulated by the state and the feds, not something we can alter. So where would you start at a comprehensive community college in the analysis of the connection between financial issues that students face and their performance in the classroom?
Yeah, I won't say that it will cost nothing to be able to do these things, but it does not necessarily cost a lot in order to be able to ask data-oriented questions and get good answers. You need the ability to be able to ask specific questions specific to your institution and get those answers. But even at Georgia State, as a large public research university, we have, as I've said, 32,000 students. We have 2 dedicated staff people to collect student data for us. So, and that's an expansion. Until the last 18 months, we had 1. So we were asking a lot of these questions, doing things like tracking unmet need, beginning to get into the issues of what impact unmet need had upon grades and then completion rates and so forth, piloting models for Keep Hope Alive, piloting models for redoing our college algebra courses and looking at the success of different models, really for years and years with 1 dedicated staff person who was collecting the data from our various systems, from our grading systems and so forth. It is an investment, but it's an investment that pays off many times over. I mean, it's hard to put a price on, what added conferrals are worth to the lives of individuals. In some ways, that's, beyond our ability to quantify. But even from a public funding perspective, those types of investments pay for themselves very quickly. We found at Georgia State, for every 1% increase, 1 point increase in our retention rate, that's worth about $3 million a year in added revenues. Well, the staff person we have collecting data is somewhere in the $50,000 to $60,000 range. It's not a cheap position because you want somebody good in data and analytics, but it's also not anything like what the gains that can be made from such a position entail.
Well, let's use that as a segue to the discussion about analytics, Tim. Most of us practice at a level where where the unit of analysis is not the individual student. Most of our analytics really are summary statistics on performance at the section level, or if we're a little more advanced, maybe cohort analysis. But you've gone way deeper than that. You made a commitment to analytics at the student unit level. Talk a little bit about how you got there and what difference that makes.
I will say the transformation was fairly quick. I was sitting here or like place 4 or 5 years ago wondering how we would get to the point of being able to look and track every individual student. And we found with the use of new technologies that that's much more within our reach, that I don't think 3 or 4 years ago we could be doing what we're doing today because we wouldn't have the human resources and the staffing to do it. The answer is that it no longer takes the same amount of human resources and staffing to do it. And so the trick is, though, twofold. It's not just to be able to track every student individually. And that's been a really wonderful thing as far as being able to shape effective interventions, because now you're not intervening with cohorts, you're intervening with individual students. That was relatively low cost. What, in all honesty, has been the bigger commitment is having staff who could do something with that information. It doesn't get you anywhere to be able to know that all your accounting majors who got below a B+ in their first math course are destined to have a real tough time once they start taking upper level accounting courses, unless you have some way to intervene and help those students. Some kind of programs in place, some tutoring, some model for intervention and getting them into other courses and so forth before they proceed. That's been the bigger commitment of resources, and that's taken more time. We have greatly increased the number of advisors on Georgia State's campus. I've used some of the same arguments I was just making with regard to hiring our data people, that these sorts of positions pay for themselves. But the reality is that the advising staff are often the first people to be cut if you have them to begin with. I know the largest feeder school to Georgia State by far is Georgia Perimeter College. They have about enrollments of 24,000 students. About 6,000 students enrolled at Georgia State started at Georgia Perimeter College. At the peak of the recession, one of the first things they did was basically wipe out their advising staff. I mean, to the extent that my voice means anything here, I would urge against that. Those sorts of positions do pay for themselves for reasons that just pure revenue reasons, let alone the moral and human advantages that come from some of those staff positions. Because if those people can be shown, and having the data to show it can be effective with your financial side, if these people can be shown to increase your retention and increase your completions, that's revenues for the institution. That's added tuition and fee dollars that would be lost and would be expensive to gain back again through enrolling other students if those people weren't there. So we've been aggressive about trying to track data that shows the effectiveness of staff people who often don't get a lot of attention on campuses, like the advising staff.
Talk just a minute about that connection to the larger ecosystem of higher education, particularly your feeder colleges. How do you work collaboratively with them to improve performance that begins before the students get to you?
Yeah, it is a challenge, but it's very important. As I said, 60% of our undergraduates start at another institution. So we need to find ways to succeed and support those students as best we can. I will give an example of a current grant that I'm working on. We have, through ASCU and the Lumina Foundation, a grant at Georgia Perimeter College, the institution I was just referring to, and Georgia State, to try to increase the success of our transfer students. In many ways, transfer students in Georgia have many advantages, or should on the surface, because we have a true university system. There are 31 schools, including Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, Georgia State at kind of the research end, and the two-year institutions. They're all part of one system, and we have a common core. So there's a group of core courses, and the syllabi have been agreed upon so that the content of the courses should be the same. But the reality is, over the course of time and with individual instructors at different institutions, students are not served in that way. There are great differences between the content of a Biology 1111 course at one institution and another institution. So this grant has pulled together faculty from Georgia Perimeter and Georgia State to, over a 2-year period, have conversations about what they're teaching in their courses. And in some cases, it has been revelatory. That the faculty have, and I've sat there while they've had some of these conversations, I thought you were covering that in your classes. You're not, we thought you were covering it in your classes. Well, who's getting the short end of the stick? It's the students who, move from one institution to another, and the faculty just assume that the students have covered material that they haven't covered, and if they don't know it, assume that the students are somehow deficient. So there's work that really needs to be done And I wish there was a magic wand and we're in the right place for a magic wand, but I wish there was a magic wand to wave and, have everybody have these conversations all at once. But they really do take time, and they can't just happen once. They have to happen on a recurring basis because the faculty are constantly changing.
And have you been able to federate student unit record performance data across institution boundaries to facilitate those conversations?
Yeah, one nice thing about this grant is we were already sharing data among institutions. For instance, one thing we've done for years at Georgia State, since we have about 20 different schools in the state of Georgia that are feeding us over 100 transfer students each academic year, we were tracking success rates, retention and graduation conferral rates, and so forth. One of the things the Lumina grant has allowed us to do is speculate and begin to experiment with better assessment models. The academic grade that a student transfers in with in a discipline, so this is a student who comes in with a certain overall GPA or a certain set of grades in the biology courses as they transfer in as a biology major, are really a very blunt instrument. They could mean lots of different things. You can have a student getting a B in a course, in a biology course, who's great as far as quantitative skills and so forth, but really deficient in certain content knowledge, or just the reverse, that they're great in content knowledge and deficient in quantitative skills. And the remediation and interventions would be very different for those two students, but we don't have that information as the student comes in. What the faculty have worked on as part of this grant are assessment modules that would look in much greater detail as the students transfer about what they know in each discipline and what they don't know. Not just content knowledge, but certain competencies and outcomes. What kind of skills do they have, and so forth. The hope is if we get faculty talking about these sorts of issues, they'll create better alliances and better alignment between what they're teaching, but also that when the students transfer in, the types of steps we can take in order to help the students succeed will be much more focused and much more strategic.
Well, Tim, I've got one more question for you, and I'd like to invite just a handful of questions from the audience. So if you have one for him, as I explore one more issue, make your way to one of the microphones. I think they're out there on stands. Are they, Carol? We're good, yes. So if you have a question, make your way to a microphone, and we'll try to manage just a few of those at the end. My last question really is about leading this kind of large-scale change. I can just imagine that there might have been a faculty member somewhere at Georgia State who wasn't exactly on board with the notion of lowering the entrance GPA or SAT scores. What tips do you have for us in leading large-scale change like this?
Yeah, I think on a day-to-day basis, a lot of the hard work is done in the classroom, and you have to have buy-in from the faculty. On the other hand, as Sandy's now saying, you also equally have to have buy-in at the top of the university. There were several critical moments in our progress at Georgia State where if the president didn't stick out his neck, we probably would not have succeeded. A couple examples include when we first moved towards the transformation of all of our math courses into the Emporium model and lowered the DFW rate. The chair of the math department at the time was not on board, did not support this, thought this was the antithesis of everything that a math department should be doing. And ultimately, it took a leadership change in that area for us to be able to progress. The current chair of the math department couldn't be prouder. We think that there is rightfully ownership of this. The measures at the end of the course have not changed, so we know that this is not just a grade inflation issue, that the students are actually coming out of these math courses learning and following the same assessment measures they were previously. But it took a different type of leadership. The advisement is a great example. Georgia State became a research institution by a very serendipitous route. We were initially a business school, and we kind of, over the course of a number of decades, as Atlanta grew into a larger and larger city, kept adding programs until we became a research institution. But that meant that our advising was, I would put it, completely incoherent. We had advisors in individual departments in some cases, in every college. There was no common record keeping whatsoever. Some advisors were still keeping records on manila folders so that when students transferred from one major to the next, often the records were getting lost. There was no common training, no common interventions, and so forth. And when we moved to the new analytics system that I was describing, I knew that we would need a different model for how we run advising. And we'd have to be more centralized, to be frank, because we'd need some control over who was responsible for what activities. And so I asked the president of the university, would he be willing to call a meeting of the advisors on campus, sit in front of a room, and tell them that things were going to be very different than the way they've been over the last generation with advisors at Georgia State. And that was difficult to do. It was not a popular conversation, but this is Mark Becker, he was willing to do that, and it made all the difference in the world. When you get called to, and you're an advisor, often ignored on your campus, and get called to a meeting by the university president where he sits there and looks you in the eye and says, you know, I want you to do things differently than you're going to do, that can be transformative. So that leadership is absolutely essential.
And it seems from that answer that what gives you courage to propose those kinds of changes and the president courage to engage those conversations is that you have the armor of evidence when you walk into the room. I can't imagine that conversation without the evidence to back it up.
I agree with that completely. The skepticism you mentioned a minute ago, in our case from our business dean, about lowering SAT scores by 19 points in order to increase success rates, it diffuses those criticisms when you can also walk in the room and show, well, here's the increase in our graduation rates over the couple years, here's what our conferrals have done. So yeah, data can be very effective in lots of contexts. I mentioned the business world and the business leaders who are impressed by it, but another group that's very impressed by data are faculty members. They have to take seriously hard evidence, and we've found at Georgia State that they do.
I'm not seeing anybody flamboyantly addressing. We have one back here. I'm pretty nearsighted. Oh, be flamboyant. There you go. Speak up. Tell us who you are and ask your question.
Good morning. I'm Diane Lee from St. Louis Community College. Thank you for a very inspiring conversation. Can you please tell us more about the analytics package? Did you buy it? Did you develop it? What is it? How do we get it?
Yeah.
Will you sell it to them? Or?
Yes. No, we're not marketing it. Yeah, we did this as a collaboration with the Education Advisory Board in Washington, D.C. I will say that 3.5 years ago, I went out with my assistant vice president for student retention on a mission, which was we were understaffed for advisors, and we knew that our advisors were using their energies in just the wrong places. If advisors are overwhelmed, left to their own devices, they will end up serving the students who can least be impacted by their interventions, which means you get the really conscientious student showing up on their own 3 times a year and checking every detail. They're going to graduate anyhow, you know, whether the advisor speaks to them or not. You also get the students who are so lost and so much in danger that in many cases, sadly, the advisor's interventions will not help. What we found is that we were not intervening at all with what might be called the muddy middle, the B- to maybe C student who floats under the radar screen, never shows up on their own volition, but who, with the right advice at the right moment, you could actually turn from a college dropout to a success story. And so what we were looking for was a product that would be data-based, not just based on kind of homespun wisdom, but data-based, and would be proactive, would have an element that would allow advisors to really target advice and interventions when it could most make a difference in changing the path for students. And what we found at the time was that the Education Advisory Board was working on a similar product. So we became alpha partners with them. We are centrally involved in designing this product. It is now, though, marketed by the Education Advisory Board. They have, as I mentioned, a number of community college partners. It's not cheap, but it costs probably no more than a couple staff positions. For most community colleges, well under $100,000 a year. They run all the analytics for you, and they also run the day-to-day tracking of the students on a web-based platform that they house, so you don't need added servers and added computer help. So I'm sure they'd be interested in talking to many of you, but I should point out I'm not gaining any financial benefits from the Education Advisory Board. I'm not on their payroll, and Georgia State doesn't get a take. But we were very essentially involved in designing this product.
And there are emerging players and products in that space.
Desire to Learn is offering something called Degree Compass. There are several other vendors who are entering this space. And although, again, some of these costs may be $80,000 a year and so forth, you should at least sit down, at least the leadership of your school should sit down and talk about what the equation is. Does the benefits that come from being able to track every student individually outweigh the costs that might come from a system like this?
Well, again, I don't see anybody at the mics, and we're, I think, at the end of our time.
One more, please.
One more in the middle. Go ahead. Last question.
Omero Suarez from San Diego. Was just wondering, first of all, excellent presentation, very insightful, and kudos for all the accomplishments. Question, do you all work under a unionized environment? A very important question.
Yes, it is a very important question. Let me take a poll here. How many think that Georgia is a unionized? No, Georgia is not a unionized state, and that has been an advantage in many cases. For instance, with the advisors, to be able to say, you may have been reporting to somebody in the College of Business, but now you're going to report to a central advising office. That did not take the same sort of legwork that it would in a unionized environment. I respect that. I've actually worked with a number of campuses in the SUNY system and other places where they are unionized, and it is clear that there's another layer of challenge there. I am hopeful, though, that some of the same points that Sandy just mentioned do have bearing in those audiences. You know, come equipped with data, show what works, and help that to transform the nature of the conversation, because there'll be lots of people who will say, I don't want to change what I'm doing. But if you can show that what the change will bring is a greater success rates, not just in a modest way, but in a transformative way, that can really begin to shape the conversation.
Yeah. Not to minimize that challenge, but I'm greatly encouraged that many of the Achieving the Dream colleges and many of the Aspen Award finalist colleges and others who have been able to move the needle work in an organized labor environment. So it seems to me it's doable. It just creates a new set of variables to deal with, and we're smart enough to deal with those. Now, we have an audition for the Disney Men in Black attraction in just a few minutes, so we're going to have to close this down. Thank you for your participation. Good to see all of you here. Thank you, Tim, for a great presentation.
Good job. Thank you.